traveling to the Fayetteville Public Library. I'm Nancy Brandon, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the library today. Before you leave, could you please fill out these little papers that I've kind of scattered around? You could give input on what you felt about this particular program, or you could add a program. You could say, I'd like this subject discussed. I haven't seen a program on this subject. And that helps us prepare for the next year on what we're going to have for programs. It's my pleasure to welcome Rachel Whitaker. Rachel grew up in Highfield, Arkansas. She attended school in nearby Gentry. She attended college at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Rachel's work in the history field has included internships at George Washington Carver National Monument in Diamond, Missouri, and the Hunter's Home in Park Hill, Oklahoma. She has spent time among the Kiowa tribe in southwestern Oklahoma. She worked on a project to collect animal tails there. Rachel is currently a history instructor at Connor State College in Muskogee, Oklahoma, and a historian at the Shiloh Museum of Ozark History. Please welcome Rachel Whitaker.
Yep. Thank you guys so much for coming today. We at the museum do cover 6 counties in northwest Arkansas: Benton, Boone, Madison, Newton, Carroll, and Washington. So most of our research and the programs that we do revolve around those 6 counties specifically. This one's going to be more Washington County. I will admit some of the people came from Crawford and Sebastian, and I kind of dabbled a little in the foreign counties, but we currently have a couple of exhibits open. One is on the CCC at Devil's Den. It's a photo exhibit in our hallway, and then we also have one on weaving and fiber crafts in northwest Arkansas, and there's a lot of really great samples. So if you guys haven't seen it, come check it out. We're going to start today with a letter written by 2 of the people who actually went on this particular trail that we're going to talk about today. It's the Tigard-Gilbreth wagon train. It was written the 13th of November, 1852, to Eli and Mary Bloyd in Washington County, Arkansas. It says, "Dear friends and relatives, it is in and through the mercies of the Almighty God that I am permitted to make an attempt to let you all know that we are all alive and enjoying the best of health at present, and I do not hope that these few bad written lines will find you all do hope that these few bad written lines will find you all enjoying the same like blessings. After a long and tedious journey of over 6 months, we got to a little town called Milwaukee on October the 2nd and remained there about 1 month. During that time, I spent 7 days looking around. Finally, I found a place that pleased me very well, with a little house on it and about 2 acres chopped off, so I bought it." Can you imagine just walking into a place and buying a piece of property? Moved into it about the 6th of December. I promised $100 in work or money to be paid in 10 months. "We are the best pleased you ever saw with the country, although it is not as handsome a country where we stopped as it is further up the country. My place is situated 10 miles from Portland and 10 miles from Oregon City and 7 miles west of Milwaukee. I must now go back and tell some of our troubles, suffering, and misfortunes on the latter part of our trip, for at least 2 things of the way was more like pleasure than trouble. After leaving Green River, we had some of the worst mountains that ever wagons rolled over. It was the Bean River Mountains. Our cattle was then getting weak, and I had lost as good a yoke of cattle as I had, or nearly so, for I sold one for $30 and it was stolen. The other I got only 100 pounds of flour for. After we struck on to Bean River, we fell in company with some of the companies that went up the Arkansas River. So there's 2 paths, and we'll get into that a little bit later. At that time, there had been little or no sickness amongst them, but their sufferings and losses on the latter part of the trip was equivalent to ours on the first part of the trip. We got along tolerable well until after we passed Trent Hole. Grass was very scarce nearly all the way down Snake River. Our cattle began to give out, and a great many died. My teams all died or gave up except 3 steers and 1 cow. That's why the title is Your Oxen All Died. Jackson lost all but 1 steer. James Gilbreth lost all his team except 1 cow and 4 steers, so we left 2 of our wagons and every other thing that we possibly could do without and went on in 1 wagon. Before we left our wagons, Craig and his wife died. Craig died 4 days after his wife. It seemed as if everything was against us. It seemed as if nothing but lying would satisfy some of the company. Before Craig's death, David Harrer had cut up several of his tyrannical scallops. Afterwards, he was 10 times worse, if possible, inasmuch as he had several loose cattle running loose, and knowing that we were short of teams, he became very abrupt and insulting, thinking that our circumstances would not admit of our retaliating or leaving their company. He didn't know that it was only on Craig's account that we stayed and poked along with that aggravating and insulting man and others that are dead, whom I shall not mention. Things went on in this kind of style several days. David had been appointed captain of camp, and he became so overbearing that the boys were very much displeased with him as captain, and so we elected Craig. This David was very much displeased at. In a short time, our great and benevolent captain went the way of all the earth, and I think that David thought the office had returned back to him. But to his great surprise, we elected John Wynn captain. He never would pay any attention to any order given by Captain Wynn. When we came to the upper crossing of Snake River, half of us wanted to cross. David and all his folks opposed it, teeth and toenails. So we told them we would cross anyhow. At this, they became very much excited to see such poor men do as they pleased. David said the captain might cross his own stock, but he couldn't cross Craig's stock, and that it should not be separated from his. John Wynn, being a freeman, told them he would cross if no one else went by his hand. So by the time we were ready, they were ready to cross, seeing we would not be scared of it. We went on together a few days, and they stopped. By this time, our provisions were nearly out, so we left them between the 2 crossings of Snake River. John Wynn went on with us. I was taken sick with the mountain fever and came very near to dying. Our provisions give out, and the grammar in this is so bad, I'm struggling to not correct his grammar as I'm reading. I was taken sick with the mountain fever and came very near dying. Our provisions give out, and we had like to have starved to death. We were over 5 weeks without any bread. We had to kill our own work cattle for beef, poor as they were, and eat them without bread or salt. Some chance time, we got a pint of salt for 50 cents. This kind of living gave us all the diarrhea and like to have killed part of us. When we got to the Grand Rounds, we found beef at 20 cents, flour at 50 cents per pound, sugar syrup, and he spells it S-I-R-U-P, was $6 per gallon. The next beef was 25 cents and flour 75 cents per pound. When we got to the Dalles, flour was 20 cents, beef 20 cents, bacon $1 per pound, pickled pork was 50 cents, molasses was $3 per gallon. It's about what we pay, or almost what we pay now. When we got to the Dalles, I was compelled to sell my cattle for $100. And they got there on October the 12th. The boats were so far behindhand that we could not get away until the 18th, so they sat there for 6 days, the day that the rains commenced. We landed at the Cascade Falls the 20th. About 26th, we landed at the mouth of the Sandy. I found Baird there waiting for Craig's family with 2 yoke of cattle. I had to stay there 7 or 8 days to take care of John Skeen, for he had a spell similar to cholera. When I got to Milwaukee, 20 miles from Sandy, I had barely money enough to buy 2 days' rations. When I got to the valley, I went to work at nearly $2 a day. Everything in the eating line is very high. We're living very hard, but the people comfort us by saying that they lived still harder. I will now tell you about the deaths in the company that I left. Huffmaster and his wife, and Minerva is dead. Uncle Enos is dead. James Harrer and wife and child is dead. John Harrer and wife and youngest child is dead. Craig and wife and child is dead. James Crawford's babe is dead. David Harrer's child is dead, and Samuel Harrer has been at the point of death, but was on the mend a few days ago at Oregon City, I think. They had only got to Oregon City about the 23rd or 24th of October. Nelson's crippled girl got shot by pulling or moving a gun as she went to get in the wagon. Evan Harrer's child died. And then there's another family who lost another girl. Stephen Lewis's child died. Nancy Graham and William Ingram, their child is both dead. Alroy Harrer is delirious and is an object to look at. Jacob Brush's widow and little girl is dead, and there was a great many deaths in the Evans Route Company. According to my judgment, Oregon is a great country. The people clear more money on 2 acres of land than you can on 10. Country around Portland and Oregon City and the adjoining country is very heavily timbered. My claim has good land, good water, and good timber, and is 10 miles of the principal markets of Oregon. I want some of you to write as soon as you get this letter. If you do not, I shall quit writing, for I have not got an answer to one of 5 or 6 letters that I've written. So if you do, direct your letters to Oregon City, P.O. And then it says, the gardens are still green, English peas are in bloom, and we have plenty of lettuce yet. So that was written by W.M. Teagard and Mary Ann Teagard to their grandparents. So what is now Washington County opened up to settlers in 1828 in Arkansas. And many of these families came here seeking new opportunities. And this one particular group that we're looking at today is actually mostly from West Fork. So that's why we advertise this as a West Fork to Oregon Trail story. Most of the people that were on this particular wagon train had only been here for a brief time, about 10 years or so, when they saw a new opportunity. On the 12th of April, 1852, a group left West Fork, Arkansas for Oregon. They took the Evans Trace Path to connect up to the Oregon Trail. Their route was about 2,200 miles long. They crossed Indian Territory, the Neosho River, Kansas, the Santa Fe Trail, and eventually met up with the Oregon Trail. They traveled 15 miles an hour and preferred oxen over horses. It took 2 tons of provisions for a family of 4 for this trip, and would have cost about $1,000 per family, which was the equivalent of 2 years' wages at the time. They arrived in Oregon the 22nd of October, 1852, parts of them, not all of them. And this group was called the Teagard-Gilbreth Wagon Train. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. A day, sorry, it's a day. Yeah, no, it's 15 miles a day. It's 15 miles a day because the military traveled 40 miles a day. Sorry about that. That is a typo on my part. How many of you guys played the Oregon Trail? Yeah. Or your kids did, maybe. Those of us who did or have seen this game played have a pretty brutal concept of the Oregon Trail. No matter how smart we were, our attempts to beat the game never ended well. Our oxen drowned in treacherous river crossings. Our whole group died of dysentery or cholera. We starved to death. Our wagon axles always broke. And then we died, like just as we got to Oregon. We never got to cross over into the promised land, just like Moses. We all just died right there at the edge. So that was really my experience with the Oregon Trail until I got to grad school. I didn't know a whole lot about it other than the video game. When I read the letters of some of these people who left Arkansas and moved west, I realized the game was far more accurate than we really want to admit. So why Oregon? So Oregon we got from the British. Oregon is actually, the history of Oregon and its acquisition is pretty messy, just like most of our acquisitions of territory, if we're honest. But this one's like particularly interesting. In 1812, we fought this little war called the War of 1812. It's misnamed, of course, because that's what we do. It was fought from 18th of June, 1812 until the 17th of February, 1815. It started, as many of these wars do, over the issue of sovereignty and land's right. The newly formed U.S. claimed that the British, who still held territory in North America, were not recognizing their right to their land, and also may have been inciting Native Americans to attack the American colonists. In the end, the real losers of this war were the Native Americans who sided with the British. The British could just go home, but the natives were forced out of their territories. This war has been called the Second War for Independence because some saw this as a more decisive defeat of the British. The Americans also tried to kick out all of the British from North America. Clearly that did not work, as Canada is still part, technically, of the British Empire. The war officially ended 17th of February, 1815, when the Treaty of Ghent, which was signed on December 1814, was ratified by the U.S. Congress. Unfortunately, it took a while for word to get to all the troops, and even after the war was officially over, one more battle was fought. And that was the Battle of New Orleans, led by Andrew Jackson on the American side and Edward Pakenham on the English side. Following the war, the Americans began to claim new territories, some not lost in the war, including the Oregon Territory. So technically at this point, Oregon still belongs to the British. And Oregon Territory at that time included Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Montana and Wyoming. So that's a lot of space we're talking about. So the English and the U.S. government met and signed an 1818 convention, which stated that they would jointly share what we called then the Pacific Northwest, and everyone could live and trade there freely. Do you think we're going to let that go? I don't think we're going to let that go. So in 1840, just a little over a decade before our Northwest Arkansas folks began to make their trek across this very delicate ecosystem, there were only 150 U.S. citizens residing in Oregon. But 5 years later, that number was 5,000. So just like the U.S. had done to the Native Americans across the continent, they overwhelmed a very small British population and began to demand more rights. In 1843, they established the Oregon Provisional Government to establish the American way of law and order as the primary form in the territory. Likely trying to avoid another conflict and the cost of one, because Britain's not really in that great a shape at this point, the British government agreed to sign the Oregon Treaty, which set the U.S. northern border along the 49th parallel. Everyone north of the line, Native Americans included, were subject to British laws, and everyone south was subject to U.S. policies. Lewis and Clark had actually extended their exploration of the Louisiana Territory to include a way to take Oregon and open it to U.S. settlers. So the plan was in place in 1803. It just took them a little while. It was rough going, especially if you were not a party of single men. So they kind of threw it away. Families would need wagons and supplies. And in 1836, though, the first wagon crossed from Missouri to Oregon to prove that they could. They had to leave their wagons behind about 200 miles outside of Oregon, but they did make it. So in the spring of 1843, a larger convoy, this time composed of about 1,000 people, left Independence, Missouri, and headed west to Oregon. The draw was not gold, although some of these men who didn't go went on to California. Instead, like Arkansas, they had the opportunity to find cheap land and new opportunities. This is actually the map of the allotments of our wagon train people as they landed in Oregon. So I don't know if y'all can see them. So right here is one of the T-girds. And you'll start recognizing, if you could see it, sorry, you would start recognizing some of the other names on here. But they basically found their own community, just transplanted themselves across.
This is in Milwaukee, Oregon.
Yeah, it's not spelled like Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So it's Milwaukie in Oregon. Yeah, Oregon, not Wisconsin. What became known as the Tigard-Gilbreth wagon train left northwest Arkansas the 12th of April, 1852, and turned north to Independence, Missouri. Shortly after leaving, cholera swept through the group as they passed the Little Blue River. They eventually met up with a couple of other groups from Arkansas at Thomas Fork of the Bear River and continued west toward their goal. Some of them split off again at the Snake River, and another round of cholera befell the group. Once more, they split up as their goal seemed to be near, some moving ahead if they could, and others falling behind. The Tigard-Gilbreth group rafted down the Columbia River before eventually reaching their destination. In the end, they would have traveled about 2,200 miles. Oxen were the preferred draft animals, and they traveled up to 15 miles a day. I corrected it there. And a trip of this magnitude would have required about 2 tons of provisions, as I said, for the family of 4. I did run the calculations of that $1,000 per family. And so that was 2 years' wages. This just shows you the change of time. Today, that would be $40,000. So 1 year's wages.
So how many wagons and how many people when they departed?
When they left, I think I give that number towards the end. If I don't, I'll look it up for you. So the names that you guys saw flash up there for a little bit, those were all the people that I could confirm were born in one of our 6 counties, if they existed at that time, and who arrived in Oregon and are listed under the early Oregonians. So it may not be all of the information, and also some of these people in there were just listed as Arkansas, and I couldn't confirm where they were born. So beginning here, we'll focus on some of the suspected members of the Tigard-Gilbreth group. So this is where it gets muddy and why we can't give a specific number on some of this, is because while the various groups mingled and mixed and parted ways along the trail, based on the letters sent back from the Wilson, Tigard, and Mary, it's believed that the following members were part of this grouping. There may be some children missing who did not appear on the 1850 census or who fell through the cracks because they died along the way, and so I don't have any official record of them. And so they never were counted in 1860 on the census either. But this will give you kind of an idea of how many people made this treacherous journey on this one particular group. Finis Francis Bloyd was born in 1832 in Washington County. He died the 24th of May, 1852, along the Oregon Trail before the group ever reached Wyoming. He was the son of William Bloyd and Cynthia Ann Wolfe. James Bloyd was 22 years old in 1836 in Arkansas. He was the son of William Bloyd, he was born 22nd of July. He was born the son of William Lloyd and Cynthia Ann Wolfe Gilbreth. He went with one of the Gilbreths to California before actually returning home to Washington County by 1860, and he was farming on his grandfather Eli's farm in 1860. He married Sarah Jane Gilbreth on the 21st of April, 1861 in Washington County. He served on the Union side of the Civil War for Company D of the 1st Arkansas Cavalry and applied for an invalid's pension in January of 1889. He died the 6th of December, 1906, and is buried back at home in West Fork Cemetery in Washington County, Arkansas. Joseph Stanton Edwards was born the 22nd of November, 1833 in Arkansas. His biography card from Oregon actually reads that he came to Oregon by planes, 1852, arrived Oregon, October 1852. He located there in Washington County, Oregon, on the 14th of February, 1855, and married his wife, Nancy Marie Hall, in Oregon, the 11th of December, 1856. His sister, Sarah Jane, married Andrew Teagard, the brother of R. Wilson Teagard, who wrote the letter. Joseph had 10 children, according to the card, but I think it should read his wife had the 10 children. James Craig Gilbreth was born the 20th of September, 1829 in Fayetteville. He was accompanied on the trail by his wife, Sarah Ann, who went by Sally. And she was also a Teagard, and their young son, William Pollock. They arrived in Oregon in September 1852, a month ahead of some of the others. He and Sarah went on to have more children, Margaret, Cyrus, Milton, Annette, James Craig Jr. Sarah died the 16th of August, 1865, and is buried in Gilbreth Mock Cemetery in Columbia County, Oregon. James then married Jane Adams Dobbins in Columbia County, Oregon, the 1st of October, 1867. And according to his Find a Grave memorial, James also served as the first sheriff for Columbia County, Oregon. He died in 1882 and is likely buried somewhere near or on his farm in Goldendale, Washington. John Ewing Gilbreth was born the 23rd of March, 1832 in West Fork. He was the brother of James Craig Gilbreth. He arrived sometime in 1852, but we don't know which month, in Oregon, and at some point went to California with James Boyd. He also served in the Civil War in Company D for the Washington Territory Volunteers. He returned to Arkansas and married Mary Ann Sherry in Washington County, Arkansas, the 12th of September, 1876, and he died 17th of November, 1901 in Springdale, and is buried at the Fayetteville National Cemetery. So apparently, Oregon and California were not up to their standards. David Ford Nelson was born in 1803. I kind of wanted to give you guys a sense of how old some of these people were as we're going. Just because a lot of the times we think of this westward expansion of being like young men or young families, and it's really not. Not that 49 is that old. I'm getting close. I've lost my. Oh, his wife and at least 6 out of 8 children traveled with him. Sarah was 26, James was 20, Elijah was 19, Richard was 15, Andrew was 11, and Lucinda was 27. Lucinda actually met her first husband, Henry Shepard, while they were traveling in separate wagon trains. So a little bit of romance there. They married at Fort Boise on the 6th of September, 1852. They wintered in the Dalles before continuing to the Cascades and then having 7 children. It's a lot of kids, man. Jacob and his family actually lived in Crawford County. I told you I'd dabble in those foreign counties just a little bit before they joined the wagon train heading to Oregon. Jacob was the first leader of the wagon train. Accompanying him was his wife, Melinda, his children, Richard, Elizabeth, Susanna, Benjamin, Nancy, and Mary. Jacob died along the trail in Nebraska after contracting cholera. He's buried somewhere near the Little Blue River and was replaced by Wilson Tegart eventually as the head of the wagon train. His wife Melinda died and is buried along the Sandy River. Their daughter Nancy died of mountain fever in the Rockies, either typhoid or Rocky Mountain spotted fever today. Albert's a little bit of an enigma. At first I thought he might be the son of Jacob Rush and younger brother to Samuel, but it looks like he might actually belong to William and Betsy Rush. Funny enough, in 1850, he is listed as living in Crawford County next to William and Betsy, but he has a family wife, Jane, and a 1-year-old daughter, Hannah. They disappear. I don't know what happened to them. So either they died or he abandoned them, which happened, and they moved on by the next census. His biography card in Oregon states that he came across the Plains route and that he was looking for a home. He married Mary Ann Parsons on the 22nd of February, 1866 in Jackson County, Oregon. Mary died in 1888, and I pick him up again in 1910, living with his daughter and her family. He died in 1914 and is buried in California next to Mary. Samuel was born in 1829 in Jackson County, Alabama. He was the son of Jacob Rush, who died along the trail. And Samuel's story is a little rough. I don't go into a whole lot of the details here, but basically he has to step up the moment his father dies. He and a brother and a sister were both stricken by the same illness as their father, but were actually saved by the help of a doctor who was able to administer medication to them in time. They were left behind by the rest of the wagon train, but were urged by other travelers that they were not safe, and so they rushed to catch up and caught up at Fort Kearny. 6 more people died at Fort Kearny, and then as they made their way across the Rockies, the sister Nancy died of mountain fever. They ran out of provisions at Willow Creek, and Samuel was forced to buy provisions. He paid $18 for 17 pounds of flour. They later bought potatoes at another stop. When they ran out of money for more provisions, Samuel was forced to sell a yoke of oxen. He could not get his remaining family passage on a river boat, so he paid a group of Native Americans to help them reach the Cascade Falls. His brother Richard, driving their cattle alone, caught typhoid, so they hired someone to take the cattle further down the trail for them. His mother then died along the Sandy River. Samuel was left with the care of 5 siblings. While their situation was desperate in the first years in Oregon, he seemed to meet actually many kind strangers who were willing to help them out. One guy let them live in a house by the, rent-free for a year, as long as at the end of the year he paid him a certain amount, and it really was not a whole lot. He eventually married Mary Elizabeth Breeding in 1857. James Shepard was born in 1805 in Virginia. He was one of the first settlers in Frog Bayou in Crawford County, Arkansas. In 1852, he took most of his family to Oregon in an attempt to see the continent from sea to shining sea, because he was born in Virginia. Unfortunately, he died along the way, so he didn't quite make it. He took with him his wife, Hannah Peters, and his children, Catherine, Elizabeth, James, John, Gabriel, and Susanna. Presumably, his daughter Hannah was born either right before they left or along the way. Can you imagine traveling that way with either being pregnant or having just given birth? Jim was one of the group who caught cholera and died early on. His wife Hannah would later remarry to Nathan Smith. James and Gabriel also died along the trail. I have seen records that claim that John died, but I found him in a later census living with his older brother William, so he did make it. There was one other daughter named Rachel, and while she eventually ends up on the West Coast as well, I can't find any indication that she left with them, but she and her husband seem to have gone later. Uriah was born 1833 in Arkansas to James Shepard and Hannah Peters. He arrived 10th of November 1852 in Oregon. He married Matilda Jane Field the 22nd of April 1861, and they had at least 4 children: Alec, David, Alexander, and Anne. William Henry Shepard was born the 15th of September 1827 in Jackson County, Alabama. In 1850, he lived in Crawford County, Arkansas, and was listed as a farmer on the census. He lived with his wife Mary and his daughter Hannah Elizabeth, and he took with him along the trail both. They all seem to have survived. So, they were one of the lucky ones. John Skeen was born 1810 in Missouri. He was the brother of James Skeen. He took with him his mother, Nancy Yardley Skeen, who was 69 at the time, and his sister, Elizabeth Ann, who was 20. He also took with him his wife, Mary Elizabeth Yose, and his children, Nancy Jane, Elizabeth, William, Sarah Ann, Diedrich, Parmela, and a very, very young Martha. While John arrived with his children and sister in 1852 in Oregon, his mother died of cholera near the Boise River, as did his wife, Mary. James Skeen was born in 1806. In Kentucky. He was a smelter. He's the only one that's not listed as a farmer. He was the brother of John Skeen and took with him his wife, Nancy Matthew, and his children, Nancy Angeline, Elisha, John King. And there's some indication that Martha may or may not be his daughter. It may be John's daughter that he ends up raising when her mother died. They had another child, Mary, who was born about 1837, but she seems to have died after the 1850 census. But before they embarked on the trek in 1852, because she's not listed among the dead who died along the way. James and his wife Nancy both died along the trail of cholera somewhere near Boise River. Elisha at least went on to live with James Gilbreth and his family, and Martha may have been the Martha that was listed under John. So there's a little confusion on who Martha actually belongs to, but I can tell you there are not 2 Martha Skeens when you start tracking this down. Wilson Teagard was born the 7th of September 1826 in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He's the dude who wrote our letter at the beginning. He became wagon train master after Jacob Rush died, and with him were his mother, his sister, his wife, and his young son, John Wesley. They arrived in Oregon the 22nd of October 1852 and founded the town of Teagard, Oregon, where many of the others from northwest Arkansas would settle, if only briefly, in the coming years. So the wagon trains that would come after would always go to Teagard when they first arrived in Oregon, because it was all people they knew. So Andrew Jackson Teagard was born the 24th of November 1828 in Franklin, Arkansas. He seems to have gone by Jackson. With him were his wife, Sarah Jane Edwards, and his children, Mary Frances and James Monroe. He went on to sign a petition for the construction of the road from Corvallis to Portland in 1853. So he was involved in local politics. John Jeremiah Turnbow was born in 1805 in Tennessee. He seems to have gone by Jerry. His wife, Rutha Louise Nelson, was the daughter of David Ford Nelson, so lots of family connections here. I'm not entirely certain that Jerry actually came with the Teagard wagon train because so many of his children were noted as entering Oregon in 1851. Only George was noted as entering the 13th of November 1852. Either way, whether he went with the earlier group or with George, Jerry died by drowning while trying to cross the Columbia River using a raft. He was buried on an island that is now submerged in Cascade Lake. So this is why we can't find all of these people. I want to point out that there are a couple of lists, and I have them with me if anybody wants to see, circulating out there. And I worked with most of these to come up with a final list of who were on the Wilson T-Gard wagon train. I verified what I could against the early Oregonian list at the Secretary of State's office for Oregon. Carol Sears is often seen listed on the T-Gard Gilbreth wagon train, and you can read online some of the debates. And this is a funny thing to me that people debate this so hotly about which wagon train their families came on, but I am taking him off the list because Oregon has him starting out in California sometime in late 1850 and then coming to Oregon in 1852. I almost left Jeremiah Turnbow off for the same reason, since so many of his older children. And his wife's record does not list a date for either one of them. This would not be the last group to leave Northwest Arkansas for Oregon and the West. Despite all of these horrors, despite all the death, despite the damage to the environment, another more infamous group from Marion, Crawford, Carroll, and Johnson counties left Carroll County in April of 1857. Their wagon train was composed of over 100 cattle, which there were 40 men, 30 women, and 70 children in the group. They arrived near Salt Lake City at a place with several names in the books, depending on who you're asking: Murder Springs, Magatsu Creek, Bull Valley Mountain, or what most of us here know, the Mountain Meadow. They were surrounded by Mormons dressed as Native Americans and a small group of Paiutes for 5 days. The numbers vary even on this in each source, but supposedly only 17 children, all under the age of 6 and unable to recount what they saw, were killed at the Mountain Meadow Massacre. Despite the troubles they encountered, many of these families who left here would establish new communities with ties that started back here in Northwest Arkansas. They had mourned together, they had struggled together, and in the end, some had even survived together. If you dig deeper, you'll see how many of them married in and stayed connected for generations to come. And that's pretty incredible, even if it is trauma bonding. I actually found an emulation of our emulator for the Oregon Trail. So if anybody wants to go back and relive their childhood, you can do that. I had a guy who 5 seconds before broke his leg, then he dies. And then it says spacebar to continue. So if you want to relive the trauma, you are more than welcome to. This is most of my, like the main sources I used. So if anybody has any family in this that they want to dig deeper on, the US Census is great, but also that early Oregonians index. It's available on their website. You don't have to have Ancestry, you don't have to have Family Search, you don't have to have anything to do it. We have some research files, and then here's the link if you want to play the game. Just to make it a little bit lighter, since that was pretty dark and terrifying. So yeah, if there's any questions, comments, I always like comments. But this is also how to get a hold of me if you have anything else that you need. But thank you so much for coming and listening to me ramble about the Oregon Trail.
I expected the older people and the children to die, but evidently quite a few of what we would consider strong 20-year-olds didn't make it either.
Cholera's kind of like what COVID was. It's pretty indiscriminate on who it goes for. And that may be who had access to certain supplies too.
What was the year of the first Oregon Trail wagon train?
That was 1840s, if you don't count Lewis and Clark. Just go back to my timelines here. (1836) were the first wagons that crossed from Missouri to Oregon. 1843 is like the one that's truly successful. The 1836 one, lost all their wagons, all their oxen, everything, 200 miles before they got there. And it took them a lot longer to get there.
That was, about half of them died, or maybe a little more than half.
Yeah.
In terms of the total global expanse of people who made the trip, was it that high, or?
Actually, I think this was a lucky group. When you start looking at some of the other sources that I looked at, just to kind of get a sense of what the Oregon Trail looked like, I think there was somebody said that they had calculated about 60% died, and these guys were about 40%. I did the math on, I'm not a math person though, so don't trust my math, but 40, so they were actually one of the luckier ones to go, so if you can consider that lucky. Yes, ma'am.
So there were several references to mountain fever.
Mm-hmm.
You know what that
So
is?
mountain fever, we don't know what it is, but it's either typhoid or Rocky Mountain spotted fever. That the symptoms that we have listed could be either one of those. I think most sources lean more towards the tick fever, just because you should have running water in the mountains, and that's where most of them are getting it. So typhoid doesn't make as much sense to me, but it is possible because the ecosystem of where they're going is very fragile. The soils are not very deep. The grasses don't have deep root systems. They altered the ecosystem so dramatically by doing this that the buffalo herds had to change their annual migration patterns, and therefore the Native Americans had to alter their annual migration patterns. So this was, to me, that was my first introduction to this besides the video game, was the environmental impact. So I doubt very seriously it's typhoid, and I think other people have come to that conclusion because I see it more as tick fever, tick fever, tick fever. But if they use the original sources, it says mountain fever. So.
Is there a modern route that follows most of the Oregon Trail now, or have they found easier?
So the Oregon Trail wasn't exactly one trail. That's the thing. One of the maps kind of shows how people go. Next one. So depending on where you're coming from, most people from here went from Independence, Missouri across, but you can see that there's some deviations along that because there were a couple of mountain passes that word got back, these are dangerous, and so they would go south of them or they would go north of them. There's another group who actually came down, so the Evans Trace path that I mentioned, that part of the group took, it actually runs down through Indian Territory across, and then takes another trail up, and then eventually at like Fort Kearney up there connects with the Oregon Trail, or what we now call the Oregon Trail. But depending on where you were coming from, you went these different routes. Some people went up the Missouri River. I don't know why they would want to do that, but just knowing who the Native Americans were in those areas at that time. But so one was a river route, one was a land route. So when we talk about the Trail of Tears, we talk about the northern route, the river route, or the water route, and the overland. And so it's kind of the same thing with the Oregon Trail. It's not exactly, there's a general direction, but it's not exactly.
It's pretty amazing. I've traveled out in that area, and there are places where you can pick up segments of some of that trail.
Right.
And it's just, the change to the landscape, and you were talking about the thin soils.
Yeah.
The tracks are still there, and it's, pretty neat to see.
When I first started researching this one, just have a laser. So like right here, you can see there's one trail going this way, there's one going this way, there's one going this way, and they're all, there's actually a series of passes there that sometimes were protected by Native Americans. Sometimes it was just the wrong time of year to cross that pass. So all of those are, and sometimes people just wandered they got a little off track, and they didn't have GPS the way we do now to kind of keep us on track, and they didn't have terribly accurate maps at the time. So this one's the 1846 map, if that helps too. So, yes, ma'am.
So 2 questions. As you were researching this, do you know was there a major motivator for most of these farmers leaving Arkansas and going west? I mean, was it a bad time in Arkansas for farming? Was it, do you know that?
There's a couple of things in my head, and I think we recognize historically too. The Civil War's coming. They know it. By 1830, like, we're no longer compromising on anything. It's going to be one side or the other, or we're going to go to war. So they know at this point. Violence is escalating in a lot of these places. I don't know that Northwest Arkansas had as much violence because we were Whigs. We were Unionists, but slaveholders. We thought that the law would protect our right to slavery, so we didn't need to go to war. So that's what a Whig, an Arkansas Whig was. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us today, but it's messy, it's complicated, but I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is just that westward expansion. These guys, if you watch, like the one guy who born in Virginia wants to see the wants to see the other coast. These guys are just seeking opportunity after opportunity, and you can watch them go across and take really cheap land grants. They set up for a little while, they move on. Like it's the next opportunity for a lot of these guys, and they're talking about the West Coast at that point as having these really fantastic, the trees. They're talking about the trees. We know about the redwoods and the sequoias and all of that now. They're talking about those things at this point. People are coming back and saying, hey, this is a thing. We think of expansion of our country as a one-directional thing, that we start with the 13 colonies, we move west. There's actually stuff going on the West Coast, and people are moving this way too. So and then people are coming in from Florida. So there's a lot going on, but there are opportunities for free or cheap land. And then also, I think they knew, like right here, that it's going to get ugly.
I have a couple ancestors who only stayed in an area until it became settled, and then there would be too many people,
Exactly.
and they would leave and go further west.
There's a book called The Mountain Man. I think it's Vardis Fisher is the author. It's been a while since I read it. But it's the book that Jeremiah Johnson, the movie, is based on. And that was his whole thing was, yeah, they were mountain men. They would move into a place and it was all, pristine wilderness. And, they didn't worry about the fact that they were contributing to the settlement and this changing of the landscape. But as soon as people would start moving in, this guy in this book would move farther west, or he'd move north, or he just wanted away from people. And he talked about how they would go months at a time without seeing anybody. And so, yeah, it's a lot of the farmers here too. But you also have to understand that once you start losing that land, that opportunity, as it's settled, those free lands aren't free anymore. So you now have to buy it from somebody if you want to expand your farm. So that makes a difference. And West Fork settled quickly. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Your anecdote about the romance between the wagons.
Oh, yeah.
So it reminded me of a program which you may be familiar with. It's called Digging the Wagon Road, and it was OETA.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it's an amateur archaeologist who spends his time going out to these places where the trails are still, and this is in Oklahoma, and collecting artifacts. He uses a metal detector, but the program, they showed all these places where these wagon trails are still visible, and
Mhm.
it's very interesting. If you're
Yeah.
not familiar with it.
There were people that actually went along and they would break down or whatever, and they would just start a community where they stopped, or they would become a supply point, and it was mostly because they failed. It wasn't because they were, these really savvy businessmen. It was because it's where their wagon broke down. So
When was Donner, the Donner Party? When
I don't know that one off the top of my head. I think that one was a little bit later, though. I don't think, because I don't have my phone on me to look. But it was part of that whole, like the passes, that's where those stories come back. I don't think they're the only ones, too, that resorted to cannibalism. In my research, I found others besides the Donner Party. So,
They did it later, now I can't remember his name. They started late, he did everything totally wrong.
right.
Yeah.
His was a mess.
And on top of that, they had record snowfall.
Yes, yeah.
Donner
And
Party was from the 1846 to 1847.
so they were one of the first ones. So there we go.
Okay, I've seen that, didn't remember the years.
I knew they weren't the first, that 1831, because it didn't pop up whenever I was.
Any records, did he ever come back to Arkansas?
Sure. There were two of our boys came back, and they married women here, and they died here, and they came right back to West Fork. They left West Fork, they came right back. But they also tried their hand at the gold fields in California, so they didn't even stay in Oregon very long. The one I think was pretty much an orphan whenever he left. He just really was looking for opportunity and like a way to support himself. But the others, yeah. I don't think most of this wagon train came back, but a lot of the others that I looked at while I was doing this that left Northwest Arkansas did. So I think they got out there, kind of like the Okies during the Dust Bowl. They were told that there were all these opportunities, and they got out there, and the opportunities were gone because they were too late. So. Anything else? Yes, ma'am. Thank you.